looks like everybody turned out this morning for the visiting preacher in Matagorda, Texas. Well, in today's gospel, we find Jesus on vacation. He needed some downtime. I mean, he spent 40 days in the wilderness dealing with temptation and Satan. He just murdered the beheading of his cousin, John the Baptist. So he went off to a deserted place to rest and be alone with his disciples whom he had just chosen. However, he had become so popular in Palestine that somebody found out where he was. I don't know. Maybe in the PG-13 news channel. But I do know that the crowds followed him. Most were really probably just curiosity seekers. Some were in search of another miracle, perhaps for themselves or for a family member. After all, he had cured the demoniac. He had raised a dead girl to life. And he had turned the water into wine. Well, that's at least newsworthy. The gospel reading this morning tells us that there were 5,000 men. And social anthropologists tells us that there were probably 6 women and children for every man. So the whole group must have been, well, about 25,000 people, which is absolutely an incredible number considering they had no internet. The crowd undoubtedly included a variety of people, merchants and beggars, travelers, the sick, to be sure, the lame, the blind, lepers following at some distance, public sinners, prostitutes, tax collectors, teachers, probably a few scribes and Pharisees. There was probably even a lawyer or two somewhere in that crowd. They were looking for a liability claim from somebody slipping on a fish skin or eating stale bread. And as is still the case, a few in that multitude saw him in him, the Spirit of the living God, and were genuinely seeking spiritual renewal. And they were not disappointed. Because Jesus spent the day in their midst teaching and preaching the heathen. The hour became late, and Jesus' disciples, knowing that the human Jesus, restrained from the loss of John the Baptizer, and had been through a physically tiring and arduous day, urged Jesus to dismiss the crowd. It was late, Jesus was tired, the disciples and the people were tired and they were hungry, and by that time the kids were praying. And it was a time well before Pampers, remember that. Not only that, there's McDonald's miles and miles away. So notice what happened next. Jesus didn't want to dismiss this crowd. He didn't want to dismiss the crowd as the disciples had suggested. He didn't withdraw and dine with the disciples and the rest of his friends for a quiet evening. Instead, he told the disciples to feed the crowd. And if you'll notice in the gospel reading, it wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. Well, of course, the disciples were clueless, as usual, and they didn't seem to get any lick of sense until the Holy Spirit grabbed them by the neck at Pentecost. Anyway, their response to Jesus was, all we have are a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. And although it isn't mentioned in the Gospels, the disciples may have casually mentioned to Jesus that those loaves and fishes have been in somebody's knapsack all day, baking in that Palestinian sun. And that it's impossible to feed 25,000 people with stale bread and spoiled fish. At any rate, what happened next was truly a great miracle. Jesus ordered that assembled multitude to sit down. And they actually did. They actually did. However, it's important to remember that there were no fire ants in Palestine at that time. Then he took the bread, the paltry loaves and fishes, not enough to feed even the disciples, much less 25,000 people. He looked up to heaven, he blessed and broke the loaves, and then placed them back into the hands of the disciples. He takes, blesses, breaks, and distributes. He distributes them through his disciples to the people. Does that remind you of anything? You bet. It's what we do every Sunday in the liturgy of the Mass. Jesus takes what is presented to him at the offertory, blesses it, breaks it, and passes it around, giving generously and graciously to fill our hearts and our lives with his body, the bread of new and unending life. No. Talk about miracles like that. It's really easy. In this holy meal, we are reminded that the ones who were not or are not counted brought the food, the trust to share, the baskets for the collecting of the leftovers, and the need to stay all day and worship and be healed and learn at the feet of Jesus. The one whom we ask to bless this holy meal this day. They had the sickness and they had the need that reveals the depth of the kingdom. The depth of Jesus' love and his power to cure. They had the fruit of his presence and the light and the power of his company. All of that made this assembled multitude that day not a huge gathering, or as the King James Bible might say, a huge throng, but a community, a Eucharistic. They worshiped together and saw and experienced the kingdom firsthand in their midst, in their bodies, and in their lives. They were the ones we don't expect much of. The ones we tend to overlook, the ones we may react poorly to, the ones we just assume not be associated with, the ones we might even despise, the ones we want to separate ourselves from. They are the presence of God in our midst. And I am reminded that we too were disciples, and Jesus is telling us to feed the crowd, telling us to do the seemingly impossible to sustain and grow his church right here in Matagorda, Texas. He offers his body and his word for a community of people in this place. And if we come to this house and we leave feeling that we have not been fed, it's because we have refused to. We have not listened, therefore we have not heard. We have not been open to drink the Spirit and its life-sustaining and life-giving Spirit that elixir. Liturgy and worship is not just words and ritual. It is for the people. It is worship, and it is bringing with our own hands and our own resources our bread and our fishes to this place. It is the sharing of Jesus, the Jesus who's in our hearts, and it is feeding the person beside us in this life. The miracle that happened so very long ago and so very, very far away is meaningless today. It is meaningless today unless it is translated by the followers It is meaningful only when we reach out to those who do not understand that the real miracle which occurred that day was the transforming power of Christ, who transformed the crowd of onlookers into a Eucharistic community. A Eucharistic community that lives on in the bread, the body shared with us by the one we were called to serve and worship.
Amen.